Oh, again and welcome. So today I thought I'd tell you a little story about a friend of mine. His name was Don Pacey. He was married to his wife Betty. Let me just read filed Senate Resolution 0087. Whereas throughout much of his life, Don Pacey owned a building contracting business and maintained a very demanding schedule. However, at the age of 57, ill health forced him to retire to a slower-paced lifestyle. Whereas while adjusting to his new lifestyle, Don was introduced to the art of wood carving by his son in 1986. Although he never had any training, Don experimented with wood carving and found that he had inherent aptitude for the art. Whereas Don carved his first work, a mallard, entirely from a pocket knife, having thoroughly enjoyed his work, he continued carving and began selling his pieces to fund the purchases of new tools. Whereas in 1990, Don began entering his carvings in the novice division of a major decoy carving competitions. His success was instantaneous, winning Best of Show at the California Open and first place Best of Species at the Ward Foundation World Competition. Whereas in 1991, Don stepped up to the intermediate division and once again his success was staggering. Entering 5 carvings at each competition, each of Don's pieces placed first, second, or third, or received honorable mention at every show. Whereas in mid-1991, Don moved up again to the Masters division. Competing against the world's best carvers, Don continued winning awards at this level. Recognizing that the unusual path from novice to master carver takes 10 years, Don's achievement of this status in only 7 years without any formal training was unique. Whereas the highest honor to be bestowed upon a wood carver is the designation as world-class bird carver. This title is determined by the number of carving awards and best of show medals won by a carver. In 1993, Don achieved world-class designation, and whereas throughout his career, Don enjoyed sharing his gift with others. Each year he donated world-class carving to the Seymour chapter of Ducks Unlimited for their annual fundraiser. In addition, Don generously shared his knowledge and techniques, giving lessons to others who were interested in the art of carving. So I met Don several years ago when attending an art show with my wife. It was basically the end of the day and we were getting ready to go home, and I ended up basically walking past the very last booth. My wife said, "Don't you want to go back and look at the birds?" And I said to her, "I'm not really interested in looking at taxidermy work." And she said, there was a sign there and it said wood carvings. And I said, "There's no way that those are wood carvings." So we went back, and that was the first time that I ever met Don. He was just a very fascinating person to talk to. He would give you all kinds of details about how they were carved. I think he even had some tools sitting there where he was demonstrating some of his carving techniques. And we ended up buying this piece here. This is one of 2 Baltimore Orioles that he had ever carved. Some of the birds are made differently. So for example, this one, the legs here are made out of cast, and they'll use different types of eyes. So for competition, for example, Virgil, or the peregrine here, these feet are made out of wire and epoxy. So I think everything has to be handmade for competition. So over the years we formed a friendship, and I would run into him every now and then, and I bought a few more pieces from him. This is one of my favorites. This is a little yellow finch. The work on this is just incredible. Over the years he had changed different techniques, so these leaves are actually made out of copper sheet, and this is copper tubing for the branch. So this is made for competition. So even its legs on this piece are handmade. You can see every bit of this bird has been carved. They're all hand painted. So of course, being an engineer, I started taking metrics off of some of the birds. One of the things that I was interested in, that Don would always talk about, is the number of lines per inch that he would cut with a knife. If you look at some of these birds, they actually look like they'd be soft, but it's just a block of wood. So at one particular art show my wife and I attended, Don happened to be there, and he was telling somebody about how many lines per inch he could cut. And after those people had left, I went to Don and I said, I've actually been tracking how many lines per inch you cut, and these are the actual numbers. So as I'm explaining all that to him, of course, he kind of gets upset. Basically what happens is he says, if you think you can carve a bird better than I can, you come down and let's see what you can do. So I ended up taking a couple of weeks off of vacation, and I went down and I spent it with Don and his wife Betty. Basically, this was no vacation. It was an 8 to 6 job. Betty, his wife, would make lunch for us every day, and Don would tell me stories about carving and people that he had met throughout his life. Of course, when you're a world-class carver, you can meet a lot of people in the world. He had met some of the early astronauts, including Buzz, and of course he had stories to tell about all of them. So it was just a very fascinating couple of weeks. Of course, this was a big process to put this bird together. Over those 2 weeks, I was actually bringing the bird home and doing work on it, and it was quite fascinating to do the work. And Don was quite impressed with my workmanship. He was asking how is it that I was able to cut these lines so fine, and I told him that, I did a lot of surface mount work, soldering and such, and to work with those precision electronics, you had to have a very steady hand. So after making that cardinal, I had a very good appreciation for the work that Don was doing. I wanted to go back and basically document the whole process because it's quite involved. And so I asked him if I could come down and work with him one more time. And this is the second bird that I made. So I took quite a few pictures. Unfortunately, we didn't have digital cameras back then. So I thought what I could do is read the notes that I'd taken, and I'll show you a slideshow of some of the photos that I took while I was there. I had never carved anything before meeting Don. I enjoyed looking at his work, and it was a privilege to be able to collect some of his art. So during my first class, I didn't take any notes or pictures. I decided at that point I just wanted to see what carving was all about. I also wanted to know if I had any natural talent. Don had made a comment that he never allowed a student to carve a bad bird. On the other hand, Don will tell you that there is no perfect carving of a bird. We'll leave that perfection to God. Of course, Don was quite religious. I found from the first time I went with Don that he may give you 5 days of his time with a normal 8-hour day. I had to spend a few extra hours to get my carving done. This may not be the normal, but I would plan on 12-hour days after day 2. While Don may be able to complete a bird in a week, I estimate that it would take me 2 weeks to do a good job. So I confess that I'm quite competitive in nature. One of the things that you miss while working with Don is he's very supportive and also positive. So you never really get the feeling of how well you're doing compared with other beginning carvers. My suggestion is not to try and compete with his other students, but to target Don's work as a goal. All the basic shaping is performed with power tools. The basic bits used for cutting are the stump cutters, diamond burrs, and kretzels. Bits are used with a small hand rotary tool. This one had a quick change out feature. He'd use adhesives like Zap to add a little bit of extra strength to thin areas. In some of his carvings he was using wood, so he would carve the flowers and the leaves. We had seen some of his flowers that were so thin they were opaque. Again, my first bird was the cardinal. Don said that most people would start with a smaller bird. From my limited experience, I found the larger bird to be easier to hold. The only real drawback to a larger bird is that it takes longer to complete, and burning the feathers becomes more critical. I'd recommend purchasing a study bird. Patterns of his birds are drawn 1-to-1. The birds are all carved from a single piece of tupelo or basswood. Don's personal preference was tupelo. He bought it from Kurt's Waterfowl Corner. Don would procure a block of wood and then let it cure an extra year before even using it. Birds are always carved as a solid block. They're not allowed to carve the head and then attach it to the body, for example. We would end up drawing a pattern onto the wood. He had a couple of different books. One of them was Songbird Patterns by Bonnie Allen in 1985. Another one was Songbird Patterns Volume 2 by Bonnie Allen. You'd have to convert your pattern to a cardboard template using tracer paper, and at this point the head may or may not be attached to the body as part of the top view pattern. Once the top view body pattern has been transferred to the cardboard template, you can then align the head in the angle that you'd like to add it. Once you have the patterns the way you want them transferred to the cardboard templates, go ahead and cut out the templates. Then you lay out the pattern along the wood grain. Always keep the grain aligned with the tail and the bill. Then use a square to draw a mark from the tip of the bill to the vertical plane of the wood surface to align the side template. Both bill tips should be parallel. You cut the blanks on a bandsaw. Start by cutting the top view. There's a trick to this. Only cut the center of the bird, then start from the opposite end and work your way back. Keep the uncut portion to about 3/4 of an inch. Then go back and make straight cuts from the top to remove the large sections. Once you got the block cut out, determine the center lines for the head using the tip of the bill and the corner of the block. Draw a center line of the bird located by measuring the outside of the block. Look at the head from the top. Make sure that the cross-section line remains clearly marked. Using the study bird for dimensioning, mark the line across the upper side of the bill, perpendicular to the cross-section line, indicating where the top of the bill ends. The bill width can be determined by marking guidelines along the bill at a point halfway between the center line and the outside edge. Do this on each of the cross-section line. Use the study bird to determine the head dimensions. Measure the distance between your model's eye centers and mark this on your block. Sketch an outline of the head's top view on the block. Carving the head will require more time and effort than the body. Don will tell you to always carve the head first. In case you make a non-recoverable mistake, you save time. Generally, what you want to achieve in your carving, especially of the head and tail, is symmetry of form. In other words, the eyes should be opposite of each other, and the tail should not be lower on one side than the other. Also, both cheeks should be equally puffy, and the neck and the top head should have the same graceful curves on either side. Begin to cut away material from the head. Make vertical cuts starting from the top of the head working toward the body. Once the basic head is shaped, notice if our head is cocked toward the left, that the top of the head when looking at the bill will appear towards the left and the rear towards the right. Remove material to level out the head. At this point you will want to drill the guide holes for the eyes while the sides of the head are flat. Locate the center of the eye measuring from the tip of the bill back and the top of the head. Obtain your measurements using the study bird. Don says to cut the eye sockets one size over normal. For the blue jay I used 8 millimeters. Now we're ready to finish shaping the head. Never work on one part of the bird for too long a period. Don says just remove a little bit of wood at a time. Spend time looking at your carving as you proceed. It's easy to take wood off, but you can't put it back. The following pictures show the head pretty well finished, and I've started to rough in the body, tail, and wings. Make sure that you keep the tail straight and symmetrical. At this point, do not remove too much wood. As we begin to cut the tail feathers, we'll need this thickness. Using the study bird, measure the distance from the base of the table to the lowest part of the wing. Mark this on your carving. Now sketch the wing outlines. Following your lines, make about a 1/8 inch deep cut as shown, and then repeat this for both wings. Then we mark the breast, and we follow the markings to the bib location around the neck. The bib is a fairly shallow cut. Start with a 1/16 inch deep cut. The breast is a much deeper cut. Start with about an 1/8 inch deep. The center triangle between the breast and the legs is to be flat. Cutting the wing feathers, start by sketching the feathers on the wing. Make sure to count the number of feathers on your study bird and make the same number on your carving. Once completed, use your inverted cone to cut the feathers as shown. Once the feathers are cut, round them over. Shown is the completed wings and bib area. Notice the eyebrow area now sketched into my carving. It seems that most people are focused on the details of the head more than any other part of the body. Adding more detail in this area makes a big difference in the outcome of your carving. The next step is to sketch the tail feathers as shown. Once again, make sure to draw the correct number of feathers on both sides of the tail. Once again, start with the inverted cone and cut along the tail feathers. Once you've completed, you may begin to round off the feathers. Notice that the tail is symmetrical. It's not a good idea to carve on any one area of the bird for too long a period. Notice that I still have not cut the eyebrow areas. I'll do that next. We may now set the eyes in place. Make sure that you've cut the hole to the proper size. Use the actual eyes to check the hole diameter. Next, put a small amount of wood putty into the eye sockets. Insert the eye and set it into place using the eraser end of a pencil. Set the depth of your eyes by viewing them from the top of your head. Once the eyes have been set, we can make our eyelids by covering each eye with some wood filler. Once the filler has been allowed to dry, remove the excess using your burning knife. The feathers are actually cut with a hot knife. It's kind of like a soldering iron in that you've got a razor blade that you're pushing a lot of current through. So this is called burning. Don tells me this is typically where people have problems. Burning is the actual process of using the heated knife blade to cut our feather patterns into the bird. Don't make very deep cuts and keep the blade heat low. The deeper cuts and darker wood is much harder to paint. Practice burning feather patterns onto a scrap block of wood before touching your bird. In my case, Don allowed me to take a knife home to practice with. Start by cutting feathers on your wing. Start at the bottom of the feather and work your way up. Undercut each feather as you go. Make sure that your feathers always follow towards the back of the bird. Every feather has a quill. Make sure that you start each feather from your quill line. One last point is before making the cut, push your blade into the next higher feather a small amount, then start the cut. Quills can be made by first sketching their location on your feather. Next, cut along the outline of your quill. Then, using the flat edge of your knife blade, lower the area surrounding the quill. This will give the quill a raised effect. Now you finish burning the rest of your feather. You can make your feathers look more 3D by layering them. This is done by using the flat edge of your knife blade to lower the area of the next feather in the sequence. For me, painting them was the hardest part. Unlike the knife, making the paintbrush go where you want is difficult. That whole process is an art in of itself, and it's not something I could put into notes at this time or possibly ever. All the painting is done with oil-based paint. The paint medium or the carrier is made using the following materials: 13 parts of spirited gum, 1 part of copal, and then 1 part of pale drying oil. The carrier is blended with the paint as you go along. Its purpose is to carry the paint into the deep parts of our burn lines. Before painting the carving, we have to seal the wood. We use Kurtz Turquoise Rapid Dry Wood Sealer. Saturate the wood carving. The sealer can be dried with a common hair dryer. Here we see the master mixing some paint. It's way beyond me to explain how to match the colors. Let me just quote what Don said: "We must waste paint." Now his wife begs to differ with him in this area, but it's hard to criticize the results. The paint is mixed with cobalt dryer before use. Start by painting the bill and the areas around the eye, followed by the bib. The black is made from a 50-50 mixture of ultramarine blue and the bird amber. Note the white outline in my head feathers. That's Don's hand and arm doing my modeling. Spend time blending the colors. There are no stark lines on a real bird. Blending's an art in of itself. Don has painted every set of feet I have ever used. He says that's the easy part, so he just goes ahead and does it for me. Sometimes things go wrong and maybe you remove too much wood. It is possible to do some repairs to the carving. Berry Plastics makes a 2-part epoxy. This can be used to build up areas that will not be burned. This is looking at some of Don's carvings. I made the small finch and the cardinal with that nut hatch in the back. That's one of Don's. See, the berries here are made out of wood. Same with the leaves. You get an idea how thin those are. And again, the leaves on the finch are made from copper foil. Again, you can just see how fine those lines are cut. They're truly works of art.